Hi everyone. I am going to take the next few minutes to give you a brief demonstration of how to use the Spe-CN forest ecosystem model, since you will all be using it for this week's exercise. So when you are ready to open up the model, once you've downloaded it from Canvas, go to where you've stored the file and open up the modeling file, which sometimes takes a minute. It's a very large file. All right, well, I already have a piece that I can't show you. Normally, when you open up this file, it gives you a warning at the top of the screen here, kind of where my cursor is, that asks you whether it's okay to run this particular file because it could be dangerous. So you will need to authorize it. It has a big macro behind it. The model itself runs via a macro behind the Excel spreadsheet. So you'll need to authorize that when you see the warning label. It's usually in a kind of a yellow coloring. I'm not sure why it's not showing up on my version of this at the moment. So here you are. You've opened Spe-CN. You're on the parameter sheet. As you can see, there are a number of different worksheets here, not all of which you'll need to use. But the parameter sheet you will need. There's a button here for running the model, which you will also need once you've set the parameters the way you want to set them. So once you're in the parameter sheet, this gives you the option of seeing all the different species that are included in the model. You see them listed here. These are species typical of the Northeast: sugar maple, beech, red oak, yellow birch, hemlock, etc. This particular run is configured for a demonstration of the effects of the emerald ash borer on the forest. So if you note that which species are present here, sugar maple is set here to have a production fraction of 0.2 throughout the run, or 20%. The production fraction tells you the fraction of the canopy that a specific species occupies. And then this particular model run is configured to be dominated by white ash, which is about 80% of the canopy. And this was true in each of the years that are listed here. So if you were changing your simulation, you might decide that you wanted species to come in or come out in different years, and you can specify both the year at a given time step and the production fraction for each species that's present in the forest at that time. We'll change these parameters in just a minute to simulate an actual invasion by emerald ash borer. If we continue to scroll down through the parameter sheet, you can see all of the different properties that determine how each species does during a model run. So if we were looking at that same suite of species listed above, we could now see the foliar nitrogen concentrations for those species, the range in foliar nitrogen concentrations, the amount of nitrogen that's resorbed into the tree before litter fall, lignin concentrations in the litter. This is all the foliage. And if you continue over to the right, you'll see the fine wood properties, the coarse wood properties, the root and litter properties. There are some soil properties farther out in this part of the spreadsheet. So you can see that a lot of different parameters that influence how species cycle carbon and nitrogen are within this parameter sheet. You won't need to change any of those. Those are simply set for the Northeast. Down here we have the climate. There are a number of different relationships here with regard to allocation of carbon and nitrogen, net primary productivity relationships, etc. Those you won't need to change either. But if you come down to the atmospheric nitrogen deposition numbers, one of the things that you might be interested in changing as you run a model scenario is how much nitrogen is reaching the forest by way of atmospheric deposition. This again gives you an opportunity to set a model year at the beginning of any change in nitrogen deposition that you might want to implement. the midpoint of that change, and then the point at which nitrogen deposition stabilizes. This particular run is currently set to an approximation of the actual scenario for the Catskills. The model runs until 1940 at a nitrogen deposition of 0.2 grams of nitrogen per meter squared per year. Nitrogen deposition increased through the 1900s to a high point in about 1990, like you see here, and then declined until about 2010 value of 0.67 grams of nitrogen per meter squared per year. Clearly, it hasn't actually been stable since 2010, so this is an approximation. And perhaps you have some different nitrogen scenarios that you'd like to run beyond the year 2010. This is where you would add those changes. So you might want to change the nitrogen deposition regime. You might want to change the species composition. That would be here. You might also want to change the harvest regime or disturbance regime for the forest that you're simulating. So in order to do that, you would go to the next worksheet called disturbance parameters that you see here. And this is where you determine how many disturbances are hitting the forest. You would set the number of disturbances. This is set to 1 in this baseline run because the goal here is to simulate a realistic forest. Clearly, a forest that had not been disturbed throughout the entire model run would not be realistic for our area. Most of our forests have been harvested at least once. So this run is set to have a harvest, one harvest. You could set this to 3, you could set it to 4, up to 4 disturbances are possible. For example, if you were testing to see what happens if the forest is disturbed repeatedly. For a question about sustainable harvest, for example. I'm going to leave it set at 1 disturbance. This one is set for this first disturbance to be in the year 1910 to simulate a harvest a little over 100 years ago as a way of setting the baseline condition for this forest stand. If we scroll down, you can see the species parameters. You can identify what fraction of the total biomass in the forest is killed by the disturbance. Let's say there was a harvest and 80% of the forest was disturbed, lost those trees. That's what's set here. You can also identify the fraction of that dead biomass that was removed from the site for the harvest. This is suggesting that 90% of the biomass that was killed was actually removed from the site as well. Finally, there is a portion of the parameter sheet here that allows you to specify the fraction of the forest floor that was disturbed or lost as a result of the harvest. This particular run is making the assumption that about 10% of the forest floor is impacted by the harvest activities. But if you are asking a question about soil disturbance, you might want to run the model with different levels of loss of the forest floor. So these are the disturbance parameters. Again, you have to set the number of disturbances, the year in which they take place, and month. And then the fraction of the biomass that might be killed for each species that's present in the run, and then the fraction of the biomass that's removed from the site, if any. If you were simulating a fire, nothing would be removed, for example. So those are the main parameters that you'll be changing. So let's do a sample run so you can see how this works. You wanted to simulate a run in which sugar maple, for example, between 2020 and 2040 actually took over the forest. You need to set it to stay that way throughout the rest of the time period. Whereas ash between 2020 and 2040 went to 0 because of the emerald ash borer. You would program these 2 species as you see here. So now we have a transition from maple at a low level to maple at a high level. Actually, I got this wrong. We're taking over entirely. So we want it to be at 100%. and we're making ash go to 0 over that same time period. It's important that in any given year, your total production fraction not sum to be greater than 1 or 100% of the canopy. If you do have it total a number greater than 1, then the model will give you an error and ask you to fix it. So once that's in place, I'm going to leave the nitrogen deposition regime alone. We're going to assume just a regular nitrogen deposition regime for the Catskill Mountains, which is where this scenario was based. So I'll leave the disturbance regime, as you see here, alone. And the rest of the parameters, therefore, would be set. So I'm going to go up here and click Run Model. And this will take a minute. Sometimes it takes up to about a minute for the code to run. Depends a bit on the speed of your computer. If you have only a Macintosh computer available to you, this model will not run. And so you may need to ask a friend from the class to run a model scenario and send you the results so that you can see what the model is producing. There we go. Okay. When the model runs, it will pull up exactly where the graphs are located so that you can see what happened due to the scenario you've run. I forgot to show you before I started what these graphs look like for the baseline run that was already on in the model before we began. So feel free to take a look at that and compare it to this. The version you've downloaded will have that baseline run in place. But what you can see here is a series of graphs where we can evaluate the disturbance that we've applied. Here in the blue is sugar maple, and in the purple is white ash. So you can see that net primary productivity for white ash was higher. It was 80% of the canopy until that 2020 disturbance when it plummeted. And sugar maple was quite low, but increased rapidly with the loss of ash. This little jog here in net primary productivity is indicative of the harvest that we put in place so that we would be implementing this disturbance in a second growth forest rather than an old growth forest. You can also see an increase in productivity right about here. And here's the total NPP right here. This increase is related to the increase in nitrogen deposition that the model has simulated through the second half of the 1900s. We'll see that even better in the leaching graph in a moment. Here are the plant pools in this graph. You can see that plant carbon is in blue. And on the blue graph, you can see the harvest in the early 1900s where biomass plummeted, and then an increase in recovery until 2020 when biomass went down quite a lot as a result of the emerald ash borer. It's been recovering as a new sugar maple stand since that time. Let's walk through one more graph here. If we look at nitrate leaching after this emerald ash borer invasion, here's the leaching graph. If you trace that through time, you can see a spike in leaching in the early 1900s related to the harvest, and then an increase in leaching through the late 1900s to peak in 1990 as a result of the nitrogen deposition hitting the forest floor. And then another spike in nitrate leaching related to the transition between the two species from an ash-dominated to a maple-dominated forest. So these are the kinds of patterns that you can see when you run the Spe-CN model and look at the output through time.